Welcome everyone to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I'm Kathy Group. I'm the Advertising and Marketing Manager for HGA, and I'm your host today. Today's episode of Textiles and Tea is sponsored by Schiffer Publishing. This family-owned business is publisher of all things nonfiction. If you're looking for a topic, I'm sure Schiffer has it. Wonderful art books, wonderful fiber books. See more at schifferbooks.com. We will take questions today in the last 15 minutes of the program. Please use the Q&A. We won't really see the question if you put it in the chat, but we love your chats. Feel free to put in other things in the chat box. Today, we have Majeda Clark. She's inspired by her own cultural background, and her designs celebrate regional weaving techniques and the identity of the maker. Whether in small batch of production or entirely by handmade, she seeks sustainability and local production. She works closely with the local community, such as UNESCO's Jamdani Weavers of Dhaka in Bangladesh. She focuses on keeping those ancient techniques alive. Majeda's millwork woven pieces also explore a lost weaving heritage and can be traced back for generations. Her work's been exhibited throughout Europe, and she sells her work online and through commissions. Hi, Majeda. It's good to have you here today.
Hi, good to see you.
Well, our first question, what is your favorite tea?
Yeah, do you know, that is a very easy answer because I grew up on a tea plantation in the region. And so it's Assam tea, and it will always be Assam tea. It's what my grandparents basically grew and sold to all across the world.
That's amazing. I didn't know that when we talked. I thought, another tea question.
No, I love tea.
Well, how did you get started in fiber?
Okay, so I came into it quite late in life. My first degree was in English, and I did a master's and went into education as a teacher. And then it was actually after I had my third child and I was on maternity leave, and I did a lot of night school where I really wanted to continue with my sort of textile journey that I'd been on for the last 30 years, but never taken seriously. And at the end of the 1-year course that I did while on maternity leave, this is at the age of 40, my tutor just said, I think you've got something, you should definitely take this further. And so I decided to do a degree. So that was my third degree at the age of 40. And I finished that degree, got a first, ended up with an award that gave me a studio for 2 years by the Cloth Workers Foundation. So I won the Cloth Workers Award, and they basically fitted me with a studio for 2 years at Cockpit Arts. And I just thought, I'm not looking back. It's now or never. And I set up my own studio. Never went back to teaching, although I teach through art and textiles now, but not full time anymore.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of, so it sounds like you didn't get a lot of support of going from a very stable, safe teaching degree into getting a textile degree. And that takes a lot of inner strength to be able to just take that leap and jump in there. So how do you think taking that plunge impacted on you as an artist and on your work?
It's quite interesting because actually, you know, I'm coming from an immigrant background. It was never seen as an acceptable degree at 18. It's very important that, you know, you get a job, you get a good degree and a good qualification, and you get a stable career. So for me to have that stable career, do very well in it and be very successful in it, to walk away from that was very difficult, actually. And, you know, you do have to be brave. But I think getting the support that I did from my university, from my tutors, winning awards, it kind of just gave me the confidence to think, actually, I can do this. But the one thing I did know, that all the other graduates who are 21 at the end of their art degree, they went to work for other people. I'd worked for somebody for 25 years. So I knew I wanted to direct my own business, that I had a very strong, clear vision, and you're just more organized. I've got 3 children. You just have to be focused. And I think that just gives you the edge. because you're older, you're more focused, you're a little bit wiser, and you're braver. You're more confident in yourself to be able to take the plunge. So for me, setting my own business up was scary and hard, leaving a really wonderful career, but it was worth it in the end, you know.
Do you keep in touch with the faculty at the university? And
I do. I go back and give lots of talks. I mentor. I won the New Designers Award, I think the following year. That's the sort of 1 year in award that they give to every person who graduates, goes and exhibits in London at the New Designers. So thousands of textile students graduate there, and art students and product designers. And 1 year later, they invite sort of successful ones to come back. And I won that award, first prize. And actually, since then, I've been a mentor for them and an ambassador, where I go around all the textile colleges and see new graduates. And what I do as an ambassador for the Crafts Council is look for Black and Asian minority ethnic, because there's so few that go into art degrees, simply because they're from backgrounds where, like me, you know, they don't choose it. So to try and balance it out, I've been doing a lot of work with the universities, talking to people about how actually you can do this, as a second career, or just be brave enough to set up and do what you want to do, really.
it's amazing how much you give back to the community. And we'll talk some more about that a little bit too. You have a wonderful way of bringing different heritages into your work. One is the Jamdani cloth. Can you talk about what that is and why you were so attracted to it?
Yeah, so I've actually got one here because it's so nice to feel when you're sort of talking about it. So you can see there how sheer it is. And one of the things about the Jamdani cloth is the fact that it was considered the finest cloth known to man. And it's been a part of my heritage and my background because it's a Bangladesh UNESCO World Heritage status. So for me, this cloth was almost mythical in status. So actually, it became really important to me to promote it and work with it. But first, you have to understand it. So the Romans used to call this woven air because it's spun so finely. So before you can even think about weaving, it's about the spinning. And what 200 years ago, basically nobody except these people in Dhaka and the Calcutta borders, they were the only people in the world that could spin fiber that fine. So, and you can only do it regionally and seasonally. So it can only be in monsoon season. So the wet weather, the rain and the damp allows you to stretch the cotton. And so it's very fine cotton muslin. And you can see here how sheer it is. You can see that. So incredibly sheer material. Now, if you actually try to weave this, you're talking, there's 1,000 threads there. So you can imagine if you did anything that what they used to do with was to make saris, 5-meter long saris. So it could take 3 to 4 months to make one piece because it's so sheer and fine. It was famous because, I mean, Marie Antoinette used to wear it. It was famous for the Regency English wedding dress. It was sort of became a craze in Regency England in the sort of 18th century. So I was fascinated by this and I wanted to learn. And it was a clothes shop and they didn't want to teach strangers. But because I was Bengali, I was a sort of insider, but also because I was British, I was enough of an outsider not to poach, you know, that they felt that I would learn and respect it as an objective observer. So they taught me. They taught me how to do this technique. It's a technique that's very unique in the sense that it looks the same on both sides. So actually, as a fiber, as a cloth, it's very versatile. So when you weave, you get something opposite happening at the back. With this cloth, it's almost like a print, isn't it? It's sort of completely sheer. So when I was watching them and I studied them for about a year, I, you know, visited their homes, stayed with them in their homes. We sort of looked at how to make them sustainable. And that was the biggest issue, was that they were disappearing they've got UNESCO World Heritage status. So they were disappearing as a group, as a society. It's a cottage industry. You have the weavers village, you have the spinners village, and they basically made these saris that took months, and I thought, well, why don't you make something else that would appeal to a wider audience? So I started designing for them and looking at things like window treatments. So if you put them on a window, what you get is this beautiful sheer light, but you also get the vivid modern patterns. And what they couldn't do was create, their patterns were packed. So what you've got was, there was no spacing. So that's where I came in as a sort of European aesthetic training to say, actually, let's take out the color, let's take out the pattern, and let's sort of give some space and breathing space so you really see the sheer qualities. And then when I said we'll go straight back to using just black and white indigo dyes, keep it on a natural cream sheer warp, don't add loads of vivid color, but then have pops to show, you know, so we've got this pop of orange neon, but don't overfill it. It then immediately becomes appealing to a sort of European Western audience, not just Bengali people. But actually, historically, at the British Museum and the V&A Museum in the UK, that's where the best examples of Jamdani are, not in Bangladesh, sort of really old pieces. And when I studied that for my dissertation, I noticed that they were nearly always indigo dyed and black and white. So I've actually gone back to what it traditionally would have been before it sort of changed and developed over time, and then sort of took out the modernity of that sort of black and white thing. And so I sample at the studio in London, tiny pieces, because it takes me so long, get the pattern. So I might do a section just sort of this big and nothing else, send it to the weavers. I go to Bangladesh, I sit with the families and their families, usually husbands and wife. It's a traditional bamboo pit loom. They sit on the floor. And it means that because it's not within a shop or an industry or a factory, they can stop for lunch, feed the children. You know, it's a real cottage industry, grandmother's cooking, and husband and wife sit together on the floor. So when I come with my design, I sit with one of them and we make one together. And then once they're comfortable with that design, they make 10 of those. And then I move on to next door, who will make 10 more of the next design. So I spend the sort of first week making the first one for each person. And then they kind of own it because they get so used to that design, they can make the same design. So that's how I work with them.
Okay. Somebody was asking what you're talking about, and it's Jamdani. It's Jamdani, right?
Yeah. Okay. And historically, at the time of Regency England, they called it Dhaka muslin, Dhaka muslin. So it's a very sheer muslin.
And when you said don't pack it, I started thinking about the density of the weaving, but you meant color and design don't pack it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because what they do is, if you look at the saris, they're very vivid colors. They're sort of huge, but also the more you're weaving this, the more patterns you put in, the longer it takes. So what I was trying to do is make them sustainable. So I was saying efficient in terms of efficiency, you know, we could make scarves instead of 5-meter saris. So you're already reducing the time. Then we halve the size because it's not sort of double width for a scarf or a window treatment. And then you take out the patterning, so it takes less time to do. So you have a lot of plain weave in between. So this is just plain weave. So you have a lot of plain weave in between, and you can see all the space there is there, can't you? You know, we sort of fill more patterning towards the side, which takes more time. It's similar to a supplementary weft in terms of, it's almost like tapestry weaving.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you've mentioned this a couple of times that UNESCO, which is the United Nations, let's see if I can get this right, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, never known what that was, has given Jamdani World Heritage status. Yes. Can you explain what World Heritage status means, and how did that impact on your work and your work with them?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really difficult thing to unpack, because I talked to them about it. I was saying, how has that impacted your life, the weavers? Surely that's made it better. And they're saying, really, it's made very little difference in terms of the fact that they've protected. So it's almost like getting a copyright. You know, it basically means that you can only be from this region, making it in this area, in order to get this World Heritage status. It's usually a World Heritage status for a dying craft, or something that has to be protected. So 100 years ago, there would have been maybe 200, 250,000 people making this, weavers. And during the time of the East India Company and the start of colonial rule in India, 200 years ago, there could have been as many as sort of 500,000 weavers in Dhaka making this technique, because the demand was so great in Europe and the rest of the world. What happened slowly is, you know, with colonialism, with the dying out of this craft, with the terrible, I have to tell you a story about awful punishments. If you didn't meet the quota of they almost treated it like it was a factory, but there are individuals hand making this tapestry weaving. The British would cut the thumbs off as a punishment. And I thought this was a myth. I just thought, I've heard this all my life. I've heard about how the British cut the thumbs off the weavers so they couldn't weave anymore if they didn't meet their quotas. They're given 2 warnings, and then I've just found the evidence. So during my research, I actually found historical evidence in court in Calcutta of, you know, these events actually happening. So what happened is slowly it died out. People just couldn't cope with the sort of conditions, the work conditions. People moved on, and then slowly, by the time we got to 20th century, we've got the big sweatshops in Dhaka, in the factories. You know, we've heard this term "made in Bangladesh" for years and years, and it's sort of synonymous with cheap things that are, you know, easily made in sort of huge factories with very low wages. And so I guess what I wanted to do was turn that idea on its head, so that "made in Bangladesh" was something to be proud of, because this was known by the Romans as woven air. This one is supposed to be the finest cloth known to man. So we wanted to go back to this. So when UNESCO gave it World Heritage status, immediately you're protecting the craft. And they had a problem with India poaching a lot of their weavers to try and copy this, but now they can't copy it. So no one can do it. You have to do it from this region. It's a 7-year apprenticeship. And I mean, we're down to about 200 people that can make this now. Wow. And me, you know, but I don't do it as well as they do. And that's the other thing, that their skills have been passed down for generations. When I've interviewed many of the weavers, and they don't even remember when it first started. They'd say that their grandfather's grandfather was making this. So it's got a long tradition of this history, of this great cloth that gives a huge national pride to Bangladesh as well. But it's disappearing. It's disappearing.
Well, you're also involved in another heritage. We're going to shift directions on the globe, and that you incorporate into your work, and that's Welsh design in these beautiful coverlets or blankets. Can you talk some about this and where it's from, and again, what drew you to this?
Yeah, so this is double cloth, this is called. And double cloth means that you get this alternative pattern on the back. It's 2 warps joined together. So it's literally 2 cloths in one. Now, historically, this is a pattern that if you went around Wales or even the sort of parts of the UK, people would immediately recognize this. And often people would say, oh, this was in my grandmother's house. So there's a really strong memory and connection with this pattern. And I often think with textiles and cloth and patterning, you get a sense of place. So there was already an immediate affinity with this. My children's grandparents on my husband's side, they're Welsh. And so we have a really strong, so not only have I got a Bengali heritage, I've got a Welsh heritage as well. And so for me, this reminds me of my childhood, of growing up in the UK. And also this idea is, you know, we basically in the UK have this amazing tradition called double cloth that you can, and you do such strong patterns with it, and there's so much room for variety. So I tried to find some mills that would make this. Very difficult. The mills are disappearing. The textile heritage is disappearing in the UK. But Wales is famous for this technique. And this pattern is called a Carnarvon pattern. So I would take an aspect of the pattern and I would either supersize it or change it just to keep it modern. So it wasn't just the colors that we made modern, because part of the problem, I think, with the Welsh weavers were The yarn that they used is Welsh wool, which is very hard, very heavy, very itchy, scratchy. Society's moved on. We have central heating. We have insulated homes now. We don't need heavy, thick blankets made from 2 pieces of, wool. So I looked at modernizing by changing the yarn. So we're using a really fine lamb's wool, and this one has a tiny bit of Angora in it as well, but other ones just have a very super fine merino. So the weight became lighter, it's softer, it feels like cashmere, it's incredibly fluffy. And this pattern, then I thought, actually, we can take elements away from this and make it completely modern. So although this style is a 100-year-old technique that people remember from generations, actually, that technique is really versatile. And I think it can be very modernist. So then I would take this pattern and then I started to work with more modern techniques. So I have here in front of me my sort of modern version of the Welsh blanket, where we basically have taken out a lot of the patterning, but you can see a lot of the patterning. So it's more modernized, it's simplified. And this is what we mean by double weave. In the US, you call it double weave. I think we call it double cloth, is you get this amazing vivid patterning on the back. So you get sort of 2 blankets in one, but the yarn is softer. It feels like cashmere. And people don't want it on, on their beds anymore. They have it on their sofas as throws. So it's developed a new purpose. And that's what I wanted to do. Exactly what I did with the Jamdani weavers. I just wanted to modernize something that was disappearing. The average age in that mill that I work with in Wales is 70. So they are struggling with apprentices, and I talked to them about why this was happening. Part of it is that slowly the young people are leaving the villages. It's the most spectacular village right by the coast, facing out to sea. It's so beautiful there in Pembrokeshire. But actually, there are no young people. They all go to the cities. So the technique and the history is disappearing there as well. So I'm doing exactly the same thing, working with people, thinking about how to modernize and widen and develop, a technique that has been going for centuries.
Well, it's obvious to see that you designed these cloths and then you use the mills and the weavers to produce them. But it seems like almost like your focus is as much on trying to help these other businesses survive as much as it is for you to make something to sell and for you to survive. So where did that come from? Where did that desire to keep these villages going and these mills going, where does that come from for you? Do you know?
So my sort of principle, so when I first started my business, I had to think very carefully about what my values were. And any job that I took on or any project I took on, I always stepped back and thought back to what my values were. And part of those were to do with what I call the sort of people, place, environment triangle. So sustainability isn't simply about where you source your yarn and waste and all of those aspects. It's about the people as well. And it's about the cultures that have been sustained, around the world through a local heritage that they have skills in that I don't have skills in, So they have their knowledge and their skill set in this area is always greater than a designer that just comes in and does all of this work. And although I'm a weaver, I would absolutely say that the weavers in the Welsh mill do double cloth better than me. And I would absolutely say that in Dakar, the weavers in Dakar do a much more beautiful weave than I do when I'm making this, because their skill set has gone for generations. So I think one of the things that I find really interesting about working with other businesses is that I want to celebrate that. I don't want it to disappear. That's our sense of place. For me, as a child growing up, I'm going to tell you a little story that it was my grandmother's sari that made me a weaver, really, because she used to wear this Jamdani sari all the time and it was so versatile and she'd wear it every day. So, I remember it's got such a strong sense of memory for me. Cloth has memory. When my grandmother died, I took that sari and I could you can smell her on it. You can see the stains, you see the body shape of that person through cloth. So for me, it was really important that we kept that, you know, that tradition and that technique. And when areas become localized with technique, then I want to work with them to develop their technique so that they can modernize, that they're not stuck in a tradition that can be limiting, you know. And what I want to do is open it up, make it accessible to the rest of the world, and come in with fresh eyes, really. So for the Welsh blankets, it was always about the color. I just needed bigger, bolder, brighter colors, and then, you know, sort of create this sort of modernist patterning. And then for the Jamdani, again, it was the opposite. Too much color that they would use. And I sort of went, okay, let's give it some space. Let's take out color, give us breathing space. So actually, it, you know, it uses both of my backgrounds, actually. And what you find is that you can celebrate both and sit comfortably in both. And you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into either or.
Well, kind of getting back to you and what you do, you have a new collection, right?
I do, yes.
Can you talk about how that came about?
Yeah, again, another lovely story. So what you see here on the board here is this collection is called the Explorer's Palette. And I want it to look like a painter's palette. But the reason it's called the Explorer's Palette is because I got really heavily involved in looking at various explorers and the way that, because they're limited in Victorian times with what they could take on their journeys for wherever they were, their painting palette became quite limited. So they were quite creative with their painting palette. Now, this whole collection started with a commission from a Scottish castle who wanted to celebrate the centenary of an Edwardian female explorer called Isabel Wiley Hutchinson. And Isabel traveled around 1920s over to the Arctic and Greenland and explored the Inuit tribes. Now, obviously, for a woman to do that in that time was pretty phenomenal. But they wanted me, they gave me full reign in her archives. This is during lockdown, so it was very difficult. But we looked at her archives and they talked about what we could do to represent her and her adventures as this extraordinary woman. And then I noticed her beautiful sketchbooks that she did with about the Inuit tribes and the Greenland landscape. And we took some of those colorways and I created a blanket for the Scottish castle. But as I was doing that, I started to get really heavily involved in thinking about, hold on a minute, why do we only know about the great male explorers when there are so many amazing women who went and traveled the world on their own? So I sort of started to research. So this whole collection developed, and that collection is called, that one is actually based on Adela Breton, and she was a British explorer from, again, the turn of the century, 1900s. And she went to Mexico to sort of learn about the Mayan cultures. And she took the most beautiful drawings and brought them back to the Royal Geographical Society in the UK. Often, you know, she protected and preserved some amazing historic buildings over in Mexico. And so this color palette was the color palette of some of the artifacts she found amongst the tribes that were sort of centuries old. So we took each color palette from these amazing women. And another woman, she was called Maria Sibylla Merian, and she was around in the 17th century, so 1600s. This was a time, a German lady who actually divorced her husband, took her young daughter in the age of 50 and traveled across Suriname to draw the flora, fauna and wildlife in Suriname in the 1600s, when, you know, women were being burnt at the stake as witches at this time. So you can imagine how extraordinary this was. So I was so impressed, and I just wanted to celebrate these wonderful women through this collection. So we called it the Explorer's Palette because they all painted beautifully and brought things back to Europe that nobody had ever seen before. Amazing, phenomenal artifacts and sketches of wildlife and insects that nobody had ever seen before. So I just wanted to celebrate those women with this palette. And you can see here behind me, this is the actual sampling that I did. So we tried all their palettes. I actually did a painting palette, and I did all the watercolors to see what happened with watercolor. And what happens with watercolor is that you get colors fading in and out. So I just wanted to sort of show how you might have a limited color range, but actually you can do tone so well with weaving. So it almost feels like a watercolor. So that's why we often with silk, you can really get the range of colors. And then that got developed into the new collection, which launches next week, should be on my website next week.
You heard it here first, folks. You always hear it here first. This is good. But Majeda, I think you have a book in your future.
Do you know what? I'd love to write something, because I just think
I love those stories. I've never heard about these women, you know?
Yeah,
That's
I
a good
know.
idea.
Why have we heard about Howard
Yeah.
Carter and all these great men when actually there were a lot of great women, but nobody ever took them seriously? And
All right.
now we're in the Royal Geographical Society.
Vote for her to write a book. Everybody, let her know you want a book. I think that would be wonderful. Well, I love it that you bring culture into your work and all these stories into your work. But as an artist, and you're trying to sell to the public, how do you balance what the public wants and is willing to buy, and your own creative view? How do you balance that? I think all artists struggle with that, but how do you address it?
Yeah, so I think you can be trapped into thinking of something commercially. And I guess when you start your journey at the beginning, that first collection, that I ever did, I just did not know, would it sell? Would anybody buy this? I know I like it. It's really scary. And for me to commit to a collection where I pay a mill to make something in production, and they were saying it's a minimum order of 100 meters. It's like, well, what if nobody buys this? It's really scary. So actually what I soon realized when that first collection sold out 3 times, so I've ordered it since 3 times, I thought, actually, although it looks odd and brave to me, it seems like a bold choice, I've got to trust myself. And the same goes with my artwork. I now make what I want. I have, you call it blue sky thinking. Stop thinking about, what somebody else wants. Think about the what ifs in the world. Think about, what if I did this and that, what would happen? Just start opening up rather than narrowing down. The more market research you do, the worse it is. That's as far as I'm concerned. Because everybody has different tastes and views. So you can only be true to yourself and do what you love. And if you don't make what you love, you'll never be good. You have to do what you do well. And that's why we have variety. That's why I work in my studios with weavers who use no color at all and only use texture and yarn. We need that variety. We need that range. I use lots of color. I love vivid color. So you've got to be true to yourself, and you've got to do the thing that you came into weaving for in the first place. So for me, true art is not what somebody wants, it's what you want. And therefore, what you make will always be better than compromising to do what you think somebody might want.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I think that's a t-shirt saying or something.
Yeah.
Well, another saying is, I did some research on you, of course, and I went to a variety of websites and saw stuff that you wrote. And this statement I found in a couple of places says, I'm intrigued by the imperfections in handwoven fabric, the randomness of pattern and faded narratives embedded in cloth. Talk some about that, especially the imperfections in handwoven fabric. Can you talk some about that, what that means for you?
Yeah, so for me, when I sort of look at the handwoven piece, how do you differentiate the effort and the time you've made into producing something compared to something that's been made in a factory? So for me, what is the difference? The difference is imperfection. When you make something by hand, you might miss something, you might have a little hole in it, the yarn might snap, lots of things go wrong, size, scale, all of these things. To me, that's where the beauty lies, in that, that imperfection is what makes something beautiful. In fact, the Japanese call it wabi-sabi, beauty and imperfection. So for me, it's the same idea, that how do you put your head above the parapet? How do you stand up and say, actually, I'm really proud of this work. And I've spent many hours. This hasn't been mass produced by loads of people and in sort of some invisible world. This is unique. It's unique to me. And so what you want to do is show that through imperfection. So what I now do is consciously put in a mistake in my work. And then I ask people to see if they can find it. And because that piece is yours and no one else's. So how do you make it personal to you when you buy this piece? And so really what I love is, so in this, the Jamdani piece, for instance, they were sort of absolutely convinced that I needed to have everything equal on both sides and symmetry. So I said, can you just put in one orange anywhere? And they said, what, where? And they really wanted me to place it. And I said, no, anywhere you want to place it, because I want this to be different. Each time you weave this, just put one in somewhere, or put in an extra line, or an extra 2 lines, or overshoot the mark a bit. So, you know, that makes each individual piece different. And that's how you know it's made by hand. And to me, that is the beauty of hand weaving, isn't it? It's the fact that you can do something and no one else can reproduce it, and probably you can't reproduce it again. And that's what makes it so beautiful.
Well, silly me, all those mistakes that upset me.
Proud of them.
I'm proud of them now. Yes. All right. Well, after listening to your talk, I think this may be a moot question I'm going to ask you, but I'll ask it anyway. If you could go back to a younger Majeda, maybe, I don't know, 17, 18, 19, and you could talk with her, what would you say to her? Would you tell her, oh, don't do this, or oh, look out for that? What would you say to her?
I mean, I think I don't regret the path I took at 17, 18. And
I know, it sounds like a great path.
Because I use that, you know, now. So I used all those skills and experiences. So I don't ever regret the fact that I didn't do this. I didn't go to university and do an art degree at 18. And that's the first thing, is, you know, never regret. But the second thing I think is just be brave. Do what you want to do. So one lesson I teach my son, my eldest son is 17. He's doing the A-level. He'll be going to university next year. And he was like, I don't know what to choose. It's like, choose the thing you love. Don't think about what you should do. Do what you will only ever do well in the thing you love. You will always be successful if you do that. And I think that's the message I'd give to myself. Have courage in your convictions. You know deep down inside what you want to do. And it may be something that goes against the grain. It may be something that nobody else has ever done. It doesn't matter. It has to be something that you want to do. If you had fantastic sort of family support and everything else on top of it, that's great. But if you don't, be brave. It's really hard. And I think it's really important. And then there's one more thing I would say is the power of storytelling. We are humans. We tell stories. You know, if you hear somebody giving you a scientific formula and then another person telling you the story of that formula and how it went wrong and how actually, you know, this came out of it, what would you remember? What you remember is the story. So learning this is what I find with a lot of makers, is that they like to hide in a little corner and just do and make and use their hands. And actually they don't lift themselves up and present what they've done. You know, you can only do that by talking about your work. Talk about your work, celebrate your work, and tell the story of your work. You know, talk about those mistakes, talk about the things that go wrong. So every single one of my collections has a story behind it. And what grabs people is not me saying, oh, look, this is a pretty blanket, look at the colors. What grabs people is, so my last collection was with Fortnum & Mason, which is a huge heritage brand in the UK. It's a department store, you know, sort of where the Queen shops. You know, it's one of these grand old buildings. It's so beautiful. And they have this grand department store, and they wanted to commission me for the first blanket. And they took me around their beautiful store. They even make honey in the rooftop there. It's really lovely. And what they're famous for are their food halls and this beautiful turquoise color. All their packaging is this aqua color. They took me around and they said, what would you do for a heritage blanket for us? And I just stopped in front of the macaroon counter, and so macaroons, that's what you're famous for. You do these beautiful pastel colored macaroons. It's what I always remember. And so rather than show the blanket, I tell that story that the macaron collection was based on the macaroon counters, you know, and it's sort of, be brave, speak about your work and show what you do. So, you know, it's learning not to hide away as a maker. I think as a maker, talk.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Well, we have got all kinds of questions. So let's take some questions from our audience. How's that?
Cool.
Some of these you may have answered along the way, but let's take a look. Somebody was saying, is the Jamdani the same as muslin, or is it referring to the patterning?
Yeah, so that has actually changed over time, and there is some confusion over that. So you're absolutely right to ask that question. So traditionally it is muslin, but over time people have started to make it with silk, because it's even sheerer with silk. So, but historically it would have been made with a cotton muslin. The technique has now become Jamdani, not just the material. So it's a type of supplementary weft tapestry weaving, and that is the technique. But the technique is so sheer, it can't simply be a tapestry weaving. That isn't Jamdani. So it has to be coupled with this super fine sheer fabric that is almost see-through.
So it's as much of the yarn and the weave and the pattern.
Yeah, so it's all three combined. And to get the UNESCO status, you have to make it on a bamboo pit loom. So it's really specific, you know, it's a floor loom in someone's home.
But if I, here in Atlanta, built a pit loom and made it, I still couldn't say it's UNESCO Jamdani, right?
Can't say it's Jamdani.
Okay.
No. And it's very similar to, I don't know if you know Harris tweed in the Isle of Harris in Scotland. That has UNESCO status. Same thing. You can't make Harris tweed in the Isle of Skye. You know, you can't make it in Glasgow. You have to make it in Harris, and it has to be a very particular technique that's used. So that's what gives it UNESCO status.
It's kind of like here in the South, Vidalia onions. You can grow them anywhere you want, but if they're not from Vidalia, Georgia, they're not Vidalia onions. So we get that. We get that. It's protecting where it comes from and the people who grow it.
Yeah, it's protecting the regional aspect of it.
Now, somebody's asking, Jane Kaplan wants to know, did you make the blouse you're wearing?
No, I didn't, but it's woven with this lovely seersucker fabric. That's great, because it's been very hot today. So it's definitely the type of colors that I always work with, oranges and things.
Barbara Myers wants to know, did you say you get black from indigo?
Yeah, no, I actually use a combination there. We can get a lot of the black, the black that we see is actually a very, very dark navy blue. Okay. So it looks black. I dye these myself and give the yarn, I dye the material and then give the yarn to the weavers so that it doesn't run and it doesn't go wrong. But I work with indigo a lot, and I don't know if you knew that the word indigo came from the plant from India. So it actually originated in India. So part of what I do is use indigo quite a lot, and I work with a charity, a women's charity called Living Blue, and they grow it. It's a women's collective of female farmers who got microfinance and grew indigo plants again in Dakar, just outside of Dakar actually, and then sell it. And they also dye and create the actual color for people. And they've been working on making it almost black. They're really trying. So when I looked at the examples of the old saris in the museum, the reason I said it was black and white is because it looks black, but actually it's the deepest, darkest blue. It's been almost impossible to try and get indigo to look that blue, that black actually. But the weavers and the dyers in Dhaka are trying very hard to reproduce the original black blue of that indigo.
Yeah, anybody who's ever done dyeing with indigo understands that it's not an easy task to get it.
Oh, it's hard. Really hard.
Now, is there information about that organization on your website?
There isn't, but I'm about to do a project with a company, and with them, I'm about to develop a new collection using their blue, their indigo blue colors. So,
Okay.
but the company it's a charity. It's called Living Blue.
Living Blue. Okay.
If you look it up, it's becoming very well known. I think there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about it, and in the New York Times, actually.
Do they sell the dye like me as a dyer? Could I go buy it, or they sell
Yeah,
product?
you buy them as powder. I buy it
Oh,
as,
okay.
as
All right.
powder from
Well, that's
them.
good to know.
Yeah.
Now, Marianne Parker wants to know, what kind of loom do you weave on?
So I have an arm loom, which is a sort of floor loom, but it's electronic, so I can key in my pattern onto the computer. So that speeds the whole process up, just so that I can do commissions and work. I also have an Ashford table loom, which is a 16 shaft one, and that I use for my assistants to do a bit of sampling, or interns. So it's always on, there's always a warp on, and we can do a little bit of experimenting. But in order to actually produce pieces and work, I use my sort of computerized arm loom, and that's a 24 shaft loom. So that's why I can do huge, I use all 24 shafts. I do a lot of very complex patterning.
Now, someone's asking, Barry Mason wants to know, where can someone buy traditional Jamdani fabric?
So it depends what you want to do. So in Bangladesh, you can buy them as saris and things like that. But on my website, you can buy them as scarves. So I actually sell, half my sales of Jamdani go to the US. I sort of have the collection. I think the Wall Street Journal did an article on it last September, actually, on the sort of Jamdani that I produce. So you can buy it directly from Dhaka, but it's quite hard with the import. And I think there's a problem with Dhaka, Bangladesh selling cotton to the US because it's a competitor. So there's tax issues. So I buy them, I make them, have them brought over to the UK, and then there's no tax issues. It just goes directly via courier to, so I make the scarves, but I also do specifically commissioned, made to order bespoke ones for windows and paneling. I did in Atlanta, Georgia. I did somebody's house where it was 14 4-meter floor to ceiling windows in
Wow.
Jamdani, totally bespoke in one of the patterns, and we scaled it up so that it was totally sheer on top, and the bottom had this very strong black and white patterning across the bottom. So that was done in Atlanta.
Oh, I need to go invade their home and see it.
I know, because it's a private home, I can't really get photos of it, but they were very happy with it.
Can anyone have access on your research on Jamdani muslin, other than the book you're going to write? And that's
it's all going into the book I'm going to write, but I actually did my dissertation on it. So I went right back to the history of it and talked about the interaction of sort of East and West, and how it's been sort of traded. Cotton has been traded as a precious commodity. But I go right back to Romans in that, talking about it, but it's not on my website because I just thought people would be too bored to hear me droning on about the history of one piece of cloth, really.
I think you're wrong. It needs to be in the book. All right. Somebody wants to know, how do you design your Welsh fabrics? Do you use any software? Oh, yeah. Do you use software? Do you draw it out by hand?
Do you know what? I don't use software. I have my trusted square papered notebook. I do all my patterning by hand, and then I sort of create it, sample it. And then when I go to the mills, I do a technical document that's done on Illustrator. So I don't use a website, a sort of a patterning website or anything like that. It's purely my document. It's a sort of 10-page heavy technical document. It's very different from hand weaving when you work with mills. So they need it sort of almost translated. And there's a lot of limitations. So for instance, I can't do a pattern bigger than 11 inches. I can't use more than 5 colors in the weft. So there's lots of limitations when you work with a mill. And so I do a very specific document just for the mill. But it's also very good because it makes me more creative. because I have to think really carefully about how I limit the things that I would be able to do generally when I'm hand weaving. And I find it incredibly frustrating, actually, when I sort of go to them and they say it can't be done. It's like, but I've just produced this. Why can't you make this? There's all sorts of, and they have to explain it to me about the way that the shuttle goes across, and you know, the machinery makes limitations. The yarn snaps on their machinery that wouldn't snap on mine. So there's lots of, you know, things that we have to consider. But no, I don't use anything technical at all. I'm really old-fashioned.
I love that. Sometimes the simplest is the best. Somebody was curious about what's the finishing technique on your pieces. That's from Carol Davinsky. I'm assuming she's talking about the blankets, from the Welsh blankets, because they had beautiful stitching on it. What was that?
Yeah, so basically finishing is as important as the weaving. So I invest a lot in the finishing. So my Welsh blankets, are finished at a mill in Scotland that I think is the best mill in the world for finishing. And they do a technique called raise and tenter, which is basically they raise the nap of the wool, they stretch it, they scrub it, they do so much to it, but it's all done in quite sort of ecological process, using local water, so there isn't this huge amount of waste that goes on. So the finishing is actually really important, and they do quite a lot to it to raise it, because when I finish weaving it, it's actually quite rough and tough, and then they completely soften it and stretch it and make it really malleable. And then I have a blanket stitcher in Yorkshire, in Huddersfield, and she has, again, it's an area that has a history and tradition of stitching and textiles. It's really close to the mill where I produce the pieces in Lancashire. She's about 20 minutes away from there, and she does all the blanket stitching for me. And I think the blanket stitching is what makes my pieces modern. So I always do a strong pop of color when I do the
blanket. I love that on the blankets. It's really
But with the Jamdani, I actually bring them all back. They're really stiff and starched, and they're really hard. And then I put it through a washing machine. I boil wash my cotton. I soak it in salt for days. I do all sorts of things to it, but it's all done by hand, the Jamdani, not by machinery. So I do a lot of strange things to it. Put it through a dryer. I'll give you a little tip. Tennis ball in a dryer. That works to soften the yarn, and now it's really soft.
Well, do you do anything to the edges after that? Because she came back and said, what is the finishing technique on your pieces? So on that, do you hem it? Do you?
Yeah, I hem my pieces.
Okay.
So I sort of, once I've finished and we've got the frayed edges on my own pieces, I stitch those on. With the when I make scarves or anything, then I do I've got a twister for the ends, so I can twist the bottoms, and I sort of make sure that they look really nice as a scarf. If I'm doing an artwork, I just stitch the bottom and the edges and hem the whole thing, and pick up any loose pieces by threading through. And then and those are always framed, so you don't see the bottom and the sides, and they're framed in a sort of quite a tight frame where there's no glass, but you don't see it. It's almost like a board, a very neat board where the color, the edges are all hidden.
This is an interesting question. This is from Susan Caton. Do any of the Dhaka muslin weavers come to the Santa Fe International Fiber Arts? I forgot the name of it. Sorry.
Yeah, I know the one.
Okay.
No, they don't, but there are some Indian weavers that sort of do something very similar that go there, but and they call it Jamdani, but it's not. And but it's not as fine and it's not as sheer, but they do have a technique that's very similar. And in fact, I have had Indian people come to my exhibition saying, we can't do this in our country. And I was like, I know, it's like India can copy anything and they're amazing at it. And they have a huge weaving textile tradition. But this is one that they really struggle because it's so fine. People can't work with yarn this fine. But I intend to do a project with the weavers where we bring it to the US actually as an exhibition. But because of COVID, we've had to put that on the back burner. but I'm working with an ethical department store that only uses vegetable dyes, and we're going to work with Living Blue, with the Women's Collective, and do a whole indigo dye collection of Jamdani scarves.
Will you let us know about that so we can let our folks know?
Absolutely. And if anybody
would love to know about that.
And if you go on my website, you can sign up to my newsletter where I give all the information about dates and things that happen.
Great. Somebody told me, thank you, Susan, it's the International Festival Artist Market.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I haven't shown there before.
I think that's the name of it. Anyway. Sorry, I'm reading all these questions. She said, are the yarn singles, are they plied?
The Jamdani one is single, but the Welsh one is 2-ply. So the cotton is incredibly sheer single. It's very difficult, easy to snap, absolute pain to weave with. The Welsh blankets are 2-ply.
Diane Field wants to know, would you use Jamdani for Western clothing? Yeah,
I do. Yeah, I have them. Oh. I started to use them for collars and cuffs in menswear, actually. I think they look amazing for couture because it's so sheer and, you know, you can do so much with it. But actually, as a sort of, because it's so sheer, they look beautiful as it's just like almost like lace collars that you can attach to things. So quite large collars, and you can do them as quite large cuffs, and they look beautiful on there. But also as sort of shirts and scarves and sort of longish dresses, they're very sheer, and so you have to have them layered when you do wear them. But when you get really good cotton, and I finished it as I do with my processes, they're really soft, and it's so cool and lovely to wear. I think it's worth wearing it as Western clothes. Wear it as much as you can. People wear it as saris. It's very easy to cut up and make into something yourself, you know, a sheer shirt or a blouse.
Yeah.
And there's another wonderful story about this is again part of the mythology of the Mughal emperors, that there was an emperor whose daughter was wearing, so if you look at the old Mughal miniatures, the really tiny paintings that the Mughals used to do, the women are wearing Jamdani. They're wearing sort of layers of this very sheer muslin. So that is Jamdani. They were the sort of preservers of this amazing industry at the time. And there was a sort of Emperor Jahangir was sort of told his daughter off and told her to put some clothes on because he said she was indecent. She said, but Daddy, I'm wearing 9 layers of Jamdani, you know. So she was wearing 9 layers of clothing, and you couldn't tell it's that fine and sheer. Yeah. So yeah, be careful, wear it with a vest, but definitely it looked beautiful.
Well, these are 2 questions I'm curious about too. You said you soak the cloth in salt. This is from Ellen Phelps. What does that do? 1, why do you do that? And 2, what does it do to the color?
Okay, so setting the color is the dyeing process, which I do with salt, and that's a separate thing. But I use the salt to finish my pieces afterwards. And if I soak it, because it comes quite starched and quite stiff, and actually soaking it in salt, a lot of salt, for a long time, sometimes I do it for 2 days, just in a bucket, really breaks down and softens the fibers. This is a way, I mean, you could cheat and just put some comfort, or, you know, some sort of conditioner in it, and soak it in that. But because I don't use chemicals, I'm trying to do it as naturally as possible. So salt is a sort of alternative to using conditioner, as is the tennis ball in the dryer.
Well, this is, I'm curious too, how fine is the Jamdani yarn? Like, what would be the set, or how many inches? I mean, how much per pound or whatever?
Okay, you know? So the set is like, you know, so if you're talking ends per inch, yeah. So if we're talking about ends per inch, it's phenomenal. So it would be, I think it's about 200 ends, so 280 ends per inch, and that is when I do a very loose weave. So if you did it slightly tighter, the set, you could get 300 count, 400 count. And the sheerest Jamdani would use a 500 count 200 years ago.
Well, it's probably not going to be on my bucket list, but you know. I'm
Oh,
gonna just buy it from
I
you.
hate weaving it. I really do. This is why I give it to these guys in the end. I do sort of portion this big because it's as much as my patience can take.
Well, we're done for today. I can't stand it. I could talk to you forever. I love this. Thank you so much for being on here today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're ready to go and see you in England, okay? And see all see your studio and all the work you do. So
yeah, we've got open studios on the 24th of June, and I'm doing a sort of talk before about sort of, you know, breaking into working, you know, as an artist, as a textile artist. So there's lots of events and things like that, but we'd love you to come over.
All right, everybody, June 24th, England, be there.
Yeah, I was going to say Cockpit Arts, where we are, has 150 makers. So we have leather workers, violin makers, you know, silver workers, ceramicists. It's wonderful. I love working there.
Well, I think everybody is very inspired after your talk today. Thank you so much for being here today. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you want to know more about Majeda Clark, and remember there's an E on her name, go to JamedaClarke.com. Watch for her
Majeda, yeah. So it's Majeda and then Clark with an E.
And her new line is going to be on there tomorrow, you said?
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
No,
right?
next week, next Tuesday. But I do have 2 of the pieces already online.
So keep an eye on her website. You can see her beautiful clothing. If you want to buy some Jamdani, you can look and see it there. And she also does commission work. So wonderful website. Check it out, MajedaClarke.com. I also want to say thank you to Schiffer Publishing for all of their support and being a sponsor of Textiles and Tea today. Go to their website at schifferbooks.com and see all their beautiful fiber books. We want to say hey to Joe Langman, who is their sales therapist. I love that title. And you will see him at Convergence. Come to Convergence, check out all their books. They will be there. If you would like to sponsor Textiles and Tea or your business or your guild, get more information at our website at weavespindye.org. Textiles and Tea is supported by the generous donations to the Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, please support HTA by joining or donating or both on our website at weavespindye.org. Somebody was asking a while ago if they can watch this again. All the Textiles and Tea have been recorded and they are on the Handweavers Guild of America Facebook page. You can watch this episode and all past episodes. We also are putting them up on YouTube as we go. If you, I'm lost, I'm sorry. Oh, next week we have Linda Hartshorn. She is weaver and color extraordinaire, if you're not familiar with her work. So we're very excited to have her here next week. Thank you all so much for being here today. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. It was wonderful. Have a great week. And remember, happy tea.